Hey, I'm Hallie, and we just learned right as we were coming on the air, walking to the studio, that Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, has died, according to Russian news agencies. His leadership helping to warm up the relationship with Western countries, credited as an important figure who started a series of events that marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. I want to bring in now Keir Simmons. And Keir, this is news that is having international ripples tonight because of what, for people who weren't covering news in the late 80s, right? It is hard to overstate how important Mikhail Gorbachev was to the sort of world order at the time that the Cold War was ending.
Yeah, Hallie, I mean, he was one of the singular most important figures of the 20th century, a man who grew up under Stalin and then effectively brought down the communist USSR. He was somebody who brought huge change to Russia, to the Soviet Union, but also to the world, because what he did through his policies of glasnost and perestroika, which were all about liberalizing, about allowing people freedom of views, about saying let's take a new turn, let's not have this kind of dictatorial style of government that was the rule under the Soviet Union. It was all about that, but by bringing in those policies, slowly the problems that the Soviet Union already had showed themselves, and then the whole system crumbled. And then when Eastern European countries, Hallie, began to break away, people began to rise up. Gorbachev, again, did not intervene in the way the USSR had done in the past to prevent that from happening. Now, effectively what that meant, Hallie, was that his legacy was controversial. In the West, he was celebrated for really westernizing Russia and Eastern Europe, for bringing capitalism to Russia and Eastern Europe, really for some people viewed a victory of the West over communism. In Russia, though, his popularity waned as the changes that happened there led to a massive economic decline, and as many Russian people saw it, a decline in Russia's prestige in the world. And of course, what we've seen in the decades since then is President Putin trying to re-energize the country with a kind of Russian nationalism and pride in Russia, if you want to put it that way. So the historians will potentially have mixed things to say about Mikhail Gorbachev. What they won't say, though, is that he wasn't important. He was incredibly important to the way we see the world now and what changed in the world in the last century.
It is so important, Keir, what you're saying, the significance of him as a world leader. And to make sure that I think folks understand that, I know you've done a lot of reporting on Mikhail Gorbachev. I want to play the essentially tribute to his legacy, honoring his life, his obituary, if you will, for folks now. Let's roll it.
By Soviet standards, Mikhail Gorbachev's rule was short, but the last leader of the Soviet Union said his 6 years in power felt like a lifetime. In 1985, the aging members of the Soviet Politburo turned to the 54-year-old Gorbachev to breathe new life into the system. Little did they know the dark-suited bureaucrat with the distinctive birthmark would not only change the Communist Party, but the world.
Let's end the Cold War, let's end the nuclear confrontation, let's abolish nuclear weapons. That was revolutionary.
Gorbachev made friends with the Soviet Union's former enemies, none more so than the US President Ronald Reagan. They negotiated a breakthrough nuclear missile treaty and formed a strong bond. That same year, Gorbachev sat down with NBC's Tom Brokaw, a TV first, and Americans were amazed by this open, reassuring Soviet leader and charmed by Raisa, the first Soviet First Lady they'd ever seen. But it was at home where Gorbachev's two big ideas, glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, let a genie out of the bottle even he couldn't put back. We could and should have saved the Soviet Union, but we lost politically, he later said. Soviets got more freedom, but nothing to buy. The economy collapsed. While in Eastern Europe, people didn't embrace his reforms, they fled them. But in perhaps his most iconic act, Gorbachev let the Berlin Wall fall, and a year later was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But back in Moscow, his own colleagues plotted and failed to overthrow him in a 3-day coup. When Gorbachev returned from house arrest in the Crimea, he landed in a different world. Russian President Boris Yeltsin was now firmly in charge. Within months, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union was no more. Years later, he said his main concern was to avoid bloodshed. There could have been civil war in a country saturated with nuclear weapons, he said. He went on to become an international celebrity, making ads for Pizza Hut and Louis Vuitton to fund his foundation. In Russia, few paid attention to his calls for more democracy.
He's a hero to many. The majority of the world, he's a hero. To a minority, he's a villain.
Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, the man who ended the Cold War, was never forgiven for the demise of his country and died largely reviled by his own people. Keir Simmons, NBC News.
We should note that the Gorbachev Foundation has just confirmed to NBC News the death of the former Soviet leader at the age of 91. Keir is still with us here. And Keir, in his later years, later in life, we know that Gorbachev had reportedly been in and out of the hospital.
That's right, Hallie. We knew that he was sick and getting sicker. In fact, in Moscow, I guess in the last few months, I met with someone who was very close to him, who was talking about how he was suffering. Most recently, he's been suffering from this kidney ailment, and that he was in and out of the hospital. In fact, our senior director, Natasha Lebedeva, just spoke with somebody, as you mentioned, from the Gorbachev Foundation, and has that person has confirmed Mikhail Gorbachev's passing. So that confirmation for us here at NBC News that he has died. It won't be a surprise. At age 91, it was something in a way, I suppose, that you could say was coming, but equally, it will be seen by so many, Hallie, as a turning of the page of history, an end of a chapter of history, and an important one.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.